Days turned into weeks after Daniel's disappearance. Oak Ridge was gripped with a sense of dread, as yet another person had vanished without a trace. Daniel's friends and colleagues had filed missing persons reports, but just like Emily's case, the authorities had little to work with. The locals, however, knew better than to venture near the Callahan house. It had claimed another soul, and the town's collective fear of the place only deepened. But not everyone in Oak Ridge was willing to accept the supernatural explanation. Sarah, a private investigator hired by Daniel's family, didn't believe in ghost stories. She had been tasked with finding out what had happened to both Emily and Daniel, and she wasn't about to be scared off by rumors. Sarah's background was in solving cold cases, and she had seen her share of strange events. But she believed in logic, facts, and evidence. The disappearances around the Callahan house piqued her curiosity, but she was convinced that the truth lay in something far more human. Perhaps a deranged squatter, or a twisted family secret long buried. She arrived in Oak Ridge with a clear goal: uncover the truth and put the mystery to rest. Sarah's first stop was the town library, where she pored over the same materials that had once captured Emily and Daniel's attention. She read the reports of Victor Callahan's disappearance, the stories of strange occurrences, and the accounts of the missing people connected to the house. She even found Margaret Callahan's diary, with its eerie entries about the chest in the attic. None of it convinced her of anything supernatural, but there were too many missing pieces to dismiss the danger entirely. One name kept surfacing in her research: Father Matthew, a priest who had lived in Oak Ridge at the time of Victor's disappearance. He had been one of the few people who had known the Callahan family well, and there were rumors that he had tried to help Victor in the days leading up to his vanishing. Now retired, Father Matthew lived in a nearby town, and Sarah decided to pay him a visit. Father Matthew's house was small and modest, tucked away in a quiet corner of town. When Sarah knocked on his door, an elderly man with a kind but weary face answered. He invited her in, and after exchanging pleasantries, she got straight to the point. "I'm investigating the Callahan house," Sarah said. "I've read a lot of stories, but I want to know the truth. You knew Victor, didn't you?" The old man's face darkened at the mention of the name, and for a long moment, he didn't respond. Finally, he sighed and nodded. "I knew Victor," Father Matthew said, his voice low and somber, "but I don't know if I can give you the truth you're looking for. Some things, they're better left buried." Sarah leaned forward, her gaze steady. "I don't believe in ghosts, Father. I believe in facts. There's something going on with that house, and people are disappearing. I need to understand why." The priest hesitated, glancing out the window as if expecting someone or something to be watching. Then, in a quiet voice, he began to tell her what he knew. Victor Callahan, Father Matthew explained, had been a broken man long before his disappearance. The death of his wife, Margaret, and his son, Charles, had shattered him. But it wasn't just grief that consumed him. After the fire that took their lives, Victor had become obsessed with the idea that his family was still with him, not in spirit, but in something darker. He believed they were trapped in the house. Father Matthew said that the fire didn't take them to the afterlife, but to something else. He was convinced that the house, it had claimed them, and that they were calling out to him from the other side. Sarah frowned. "But that doesn't make any sense. Why would he think that?" Father Matthew looked her in the eyes, his gaze piercing. "Because he heard them. saw them. Their voices, their faces, they haunted him day and night. He became convinced that if he could find the right way, the right ritual, he could bring them back. That's when he started locking himself in the attic, spending hours, even days, in that room with the chest. The chest? Sarah leaned in. What was in it? The priest's expression darkened further. I don't know for certain, but Victor believed it was the key to the other side. He thought it held something that could open a doorway to whatever had taken his family. I tried to help him, tried to talk him out of it, but by the end he wasn't the man I knew. The house had twisted him. I left Oak Ridge shortly after, and I never looked back. Sarah was quiet for a moment, processing the priest's words. She didn't believe in the supernatural, but Victor's obsession with the chest, combined with the disappearances, pointed to something more tangible. Perhaps there was something in that chest, after all. Something that had driven Victor to madness and was now claiming the lives of others. "What do you think happened to Emily and Daniel?" she asked. Father Matthew shook his head, slowly. "I don't know, but I fear they found what Victor was looking for." Determined to find answers, Sarah returned to Oak Ridge. She knew what she had to do. Go to the Callahan house, find the chest, and discover what had driven Victor to madness. But she wasn't going in unprepared. She brought with her equipment, cameras, audio recorders, and a colleague, Tom, who had worked with her on several high-profile cases. He was skeptical, like her, but he trusted Sarah's instincts and had agreed to help. As they approached the house, the air felt unnaturally still. The sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the overgrown lawn. Sarah and Tom exchanged a glance, both feeling the weight of what they were about to do. Inside, the house was just as it had been described: quiet, decaying, and filled with an unsettling energy. They moved quickly through the lower floors, checking for any signs of recent activity, but everything seemed untouched, as if the house had been waiting for them. They ascended to the attic, where the temperature dropped sharply. Sarah's breath misted in the cold air as she aimed her flashlight at the far end of the room. There it was, the chest. "This is it," she whispered, stepping closer. Tom set up the camera, his expression tense. "Ready?" Sarah nodded and reached for the clasp. As her fingers touched the rusted metal, a sudden wave of nausea hit her. She felt dizzy, disoriented, but she pushed through it, determined to uncover the truth. The chest creaked open, revealing a small, withered journal. Much older than anything she had seen in the house. Its pages were yellowed and brittle, covered in symbols and writing in a language she didn't recognize. But as she lifted the journal from the chest, the whispers began. Tom's camera flickered. "Do you hear that?" he asked, his voice tight. Sarah nodded, her heart racing. The whispers were growing louder, overlapping, coming from the walls, the ceiling, the floor. She dropped the journal, and the attic seemed to close in around them. The temperature plummeted, and the air became thick with the same oppressive energy that had swallowed Daniel and Emily. "We need to go," Sarah said, her voice trembling. But before they could move, the attic door slammed shut. The whispers turned into screams, and the darkness seemed to come alive. Figures, twisted, shadowy forms, emerged from the walls, their faces contorted in agony. Among them, Sarah saw Emily, her eyes hollow and her mouth moving soundlessly. "Sarah!" Tom shouted, grabbing her arm, but it was too late. The house had claimed them. The town of Oak Ridge had grown quieter. More people were whispering now. Not about rumors, but about the chilling reality of what had happened to Daniel, Emily, and now, Sarah. 3 disappearances tied to the Callahan house in less than a year. The authorities had conducted brief searches, but none dared stay long. Official reports claimed they had found no evidence of foul play, and the house was once again closed off, its dark windows glaring out at the town. But not everyone was content to let the mystery fade. One person, Richard, a colleague of Sarah's from her investigative firm, refused to accept that she was gone. Richard was older, more experienced, and had worked with Sarah for years. He knew her well, knew that she wouldn't walk into danger unprepared. When she didn't return from Oak Ridge, something inside him snapped. He wasn't just going to find her. He was going to stop whatever had taken her. Richard arrived in Oak Ridge late at night, the moon hidden behind thick clouds, the air heavy with moisture. He had come prepared, more so than Sarah or anyone else before him. He didn't believe in ghosts, but he believed in people, their motives, their cruelty, and the lengths they would go to hide dark secrets. He had armed himself not just with typical investigative tools, cameras, thermal sensors, and recording equipment, but also with a journal of his own. It was filled with years of notes on cold cases, including those involving occult practices, mysterious disappearances, and strange phenomena that he had encountered over his long career. The Callahan house was just another puzzle to solve, and Richard was determined to finish it. The house loomed ahead as he parked his car at the end of the long driveway. He had studied everything about it, the blueprints, the history, every account of the strange occurrences. But now, standing in front of it, Richard felt the weight of the place. It was more than just an old, decaying house. There was something wrong with it, something hungry. He had come alone, despite his friends' and colleagues' warnings. Oak Ridge's residents had refused to speak to him, treating the house like a cursed object best left forgotten. But he wasn't afraid. Not yet. As he stepped inside, the familiar feeling of dread crept over him. The air was thick and stale, and the shadows seemed to shift with every movement of his flashlight. He knew he had to work quickly. The longer anyone stayed in this place, the more it seemed to consume them. Richard made his way through the house, his boots echoing on the wooden floors. Every room told a story. Old furniture covered in dust, forgotten photographs hanging crooked on the walls, and the faint smell of smoke lingering in the air, a reminder of the fire that had destroyed Victor Callahan's family. But Richard wasn't interested in the ghosts of the past. He was focused on finding the answers Sarah had sought, and that meant starting with the attic. The stairs creaked as he ascended, and the temperature dropped sharply as he reached the attic door. It was just as Sarah had described in her notes. Cold, dark, and filled with an unnatural presence. Richard pulled out his thermal camera, scanning the room for any sign of movement, but the screen remained blank. No heat signatures, no signs of life. The chest was still there, at the far end of the room, its rusted clasp hanging open. Richard approached it slowly, his flashlight flickering as he drew near. He half expected the whispers to start, but the room was unnervingly silent. Kneeling in front of the chest, he saw the journal Sarah had found. The old crumbling pages were still open, filled with strange symbols and indecipherable writing. But there was something else. A hidden compartment at the bottom of the chest. Richard reached for it, his fingers brushing against a cold, metallic surface. With a click, the compartment slid open, revealing a small, ancient-looking object. A key. Suddenly the whispers began, low at first, but growing louder, more insistent. They seemed to swirl around the attic, filling the air with an oppressive weight. Richard stood, clutching the key in one hand. his other hand reaching for the flashlight. But the light flickered and died, plunging the attic into darkness. The whispers became screams. Richard's heart raced as he scanned the room, the shadows coming to life around him. Figures began to emerge from the walls, just as they had for Sarah. Twisted, burned, and disfigured, they stared at him with hollow, empty eyes. Among them, he saw Victor Callahan, his face twisted in anguish, his body half-burned and writhing as if trapped in eternal torment. And then, from the corner of the attic, Sarah appeared. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with terror. She moved slowly toward him, her mouth moving as though she were trying to speak, but no words came out. Richard stepped back, his mind racing. She was alive, or at least she looked alive. But there was something wrong, something horribly wrong. "Sarah," Richard whispered, his voice trembling. "What happened to you?" She raised a trembling hand, pointing toward the chest. Richard followed her gaze and saw what he had missed before. A faint outline of a door on the far wall, barely visible in the dim light. The key in his hand grew cold, almost burning against his skin. Suddenly the whispers stopped. The attic was silent again, but the figures remained, watching him. He knew what he had to do. Whatever was behind that door, it was the source of everything, the disappearances, the madness, the evil that had taken hold of the house. With trembling hands, Richard crossed the room and inserted the key into the hidden door. The lock clicked, and the door swung open with a creak that seemed to echo through the entire house. Beyond it was a dark, narrow passage, leading down into the bowels of the house. Richard hesitated for only a moment before stepping inside. As he descended the stairs, the air grew colder, and the walls seemed to close in around him. The passage led to an underground chamber, far beneath the house, where the true heart of the horror lay. The room was small, lit by a dim, flickering light. In the center was an altar, ancient and covered in strange, dark stains. On the altar lay objects that Richard couldn't fully comprehend: twisted bones, blackened symbols, and remnants of what looked like ritualistic tools. But his attention was drawn to the far wall, where a large, cracked mirror stood. The mirror's surface rippled, as though it were made of liquid, and from within, Richard could see them. The faces of those who had been taken: Victor, Margaret, Charles, Emily, Daniel, and Sarah. Their hollow eyes stared back at him from the other side, trapped in the mirror's cursed reflection. Richard's breath caught in his throat. This was it. The house hadn't just claimed them. It had trapped them, their souls caught between worlds, forced to linger in eternal torment. The mirror was the key, the portal between the living and the dead, the source of the house's power. Without thinking, Richard grabbed a nearby stone and hurled it at the mirror. The glass shattered with a deafening crash, the rippling surface exploding outward as a rush of cold air filled the chamber. For a moment, everything was still, and then the screaming began. The house trembled as the mirror's curse was broken. The figures in the attic dissolved into shadows, their tortured faces fading into the darkness. The oppressive weight lifted, and the air grew still. Richard stumbled back, his heart pounding in his chest as the chamber around him crumbled. He ran, sprinting up the stairs, through the house, and out the front door just as the Callahan house began to collapse in on itself, the ancient structure finally giving in to the weight of its own evil. The next morning, Oak Ridge awoke to find the Callahan house reduced to rubble. The authorities would later claim it was an old building, weakened by time and decay, but Richard knew better. He had freed them, the souls trapped by the house's curse. But as he stood at the edge of the wreckage, something gnawed at him. He had destroyed the mirror, broken the curse. But not everyone had escaped. He could still hear Sarah's voice in his mind, faint and distant, calling to him from the other side. And he knew, deep down, that some doors, once opened, could never truly be closed.